Well, greetings, Cap fans. Welcome to episode 226 of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast. Hey, this is Rick Verbanis, and I'm your host, and I've got a co-host. You know who he is. He's Bob Lucius. Oh, Bob, I have a lot of reasons to think that reality is not a friendly neighborhood, and the stories that I tell distract me. And if I do the job right, they distract people from things that are happening to them that they wish had never happened.
And that right there is the mark of a good writer, right? Somebody who can whisk you away from what's going on. As Stan Lee would say, sometimes we want to see what's going on outside the door, right? We want comics to reflect that, but sometimes we just want to get away from what's going on right outside our door, or maybe what's going on right inside our house. And good writing can certainly help us do that.
Absolutely. And that's a quote from Mr. David Morrell, who we have the privilege of having on the show today. So we'll be talking with him in a few minutes to talk about his overall things in his writing career. He is known as perhaps the godfather of the modern action story because he was the writer of First Blood
Yeah.
back in 1972, which eventually became a movie. You may have heard of a guy named Sylvester Stallone,
Yeah.
and so anyway,
Whole franchise.
yeah, and he's going to be on because he's we're going to be talking today about his Captain America miniseries, the Chosen.
This is excellent. I had so much fun reviewing that 6 issue miniseries with you last episode, Rick, and I've been really excited about having the opportunity to sit down with David and talk a little bit about his inspirations and the messages he was trying to convey, and also just how that whole darn story came about. And so, yeah, this is really exciting.
Yeah, I know this is a really special story for you because of you being a 25-year veteran of the Marines, and there are some aspects of the story that resonate with you so much so that you bought some art, and then if you're a member of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Facebook group, you would have seen some of the art that Bob shared in the group.
That's right. That's right. But it's also any of our patrons who carry around that "what would Cap do" coin will find something in the Chosen. I think that resonates with them because ultimately that's what that series is all about, right? Asking each of us what would Cap do, and then to do it.
Yeah, and speaking of that, what would Cap do challenge coin? We do have another member, another patron of the show who went on to buymeacoffee.com/ Cap Comic Fans and became a member. He's actually a previous member, but he's back, and that is Andy Meyer.
All right. Thank goodness. It's good to have you back, Andy.
Yeah, we appreciate Andy coming back as a patron of the show. And if you want to get a cool perk like the What Would Cap Do challenge coin, uh, just go to buymeacoffee.com/ Cap Comic Fans, and you can sign up as a shield slinger. And there's a lot of other perks you get as well. So thanks for checking that out.
So, Rick, what have you been up to lately? You had a little adventure this weekend, if I recall.
Oh, Bob, let me tell you, it was a banger of a weekend. So, as anybody who listens to the show knows, I'm a big comic book art fan, and I collect
Mm-hmm.
a lot of Captain America comic book art. And so there is comicartfans.com has this was their second annual convention. I guess you could say it was a
Mm-hmm.
2 day show, and I went down to your neck of the woods, kinda. I went to
Kind
Florida,
of, yeah.
for the weekend, and I got there on Friday and had a chance to see Alberto Gonzalez,
Mm-hmm.
my art nemesis,
Yep. Yep.
as well as a bunch of other art fans there. There was over, I want to say, 600 art collectors
Wow.
and
Good showing.
probably like 50 some artists that were there. And
Yeah.
I was supposed to get, I get this, I was supposed to get my commission from Adam Hughes, which I'm
Right.
so excited because it's rare that he opens up his commission list. And I got this commission, and I go there to pick it up first thing Saturday morning when the doors open. And he and Allison, his wife, was there and basically said, we left all the commissions at home.
Oh no.
So they gave me this 8.5/11 printout of it, which is
Yeah.
not the same thing,
It's not the same.
but they're
Yeah.
going to be mailing it to me. So I
Yeah.
can't wait to post that. I can't wait to get it, and then I'll
Yeah.
post it in the Facebook group for everybody to see.
All right.
But I did manage to pick up a couple of pieces, and I sold a few pieces.
Well, you'd have to carry it. You have to put it in the overhead compartments, or hug it,
Oh,
in your
I
arms the
brought a
whole way.
portfolio. I brought
Yeah.
a portfolio to
So somebody
uh,
put a guitar on top of it. You just don't.
you never know.
You never
So
know.
here's the thing. Now, everybody who listens probably knows I'm a big Philadelphia Eagles fan. And
Mm-hmm.
so I I actually, like 6 weeks before the show, I scheduled my flight to come back at noon on Sunday because kickoff for the NFC Championship was at 3 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know if the Eagles were going to be in the NFC Championship. I thought maybe they could be.
Uh-huh.
And so I didn't want to take that risk. So I booked a flight that was going out 9 a.m. Sunday morning, gets me back in Newark at noon. My wife would pick me up. I'd be home by 1 p.m., 2 hours before kickoff, plenty of time. So I get to the gate, Bob, at 8 a.m. Now, if you know me, never been in a flight with me, you know I never get to the actual gate an hour before I take off. It's usually like 15, 20 minutes, something like that.
Oh my
I
goodness.
know.
Oh no, no, no.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, I get there an hour before the gate, and then they tell me at some point, after I'm there for like an hour or so,
Yeah.
they're like, "Oh, the flight has been delayed to 10:30 a.m. Hour and a half." I was
Uh-huh.
like, "Ooh,
Tight, tight,
it's
tight.
it's pushing it, but
Okay, I can make it work. Yeah.
yeah."
Yeah.
So then 10:30 gets pushed to 11:30.
Ooh.
And so now I'm looking at other flights that I can get on, right? So
Uh,
I couldn't get on the first one. I was just way too late in the standby.
yeah.
And then the 11:30 flight gets pushed to 12:15.
Ooh.
And so I'm on the standby flight for 11:17. And there's a party of four ahead of me. There's a couple in front of me. There's a single people. I'm like number 10 on the list.
Yeah.
And they everybody gets on, and they pull. They said this couple are like, okay, you're the last people. We're going to take you off this list, and stand over here in front of the gate,
Yeah.
and everybody else, you go away.
Yeah.
And so everybody else went away, but
Yeah.
I didn't, Bob, because I was like, what if?
What if I
What
give you
if
this challenge coin?
I actually attempted to. I was like, I got money. Um, what if they come back and tell them there's only one seat? They made a
Yeah,
mistake.
that's right.
And guess what?
Yeah.
They made a mistake. There was only one
Oh,
seat. And
nice.
I was like, I'll take it.
Yep. I'd be
And
like, see
then,
ya, honey.
yeah. So the couple were like, oh well, we'll wait for the next thing. So, and I was like, I'll take it. But then the lady behind the counter is like, well, wait. There's these other single people in front of you. And she gets on, Uh, and John Smith, are you available? And I'm looking around like they all left, and I'm like, please don't come back. And
Oh,
sure enough, I get on the flight. They actually literally close the gate right behind me as I'm
yeah.
on.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hit you
and
in the
then
backside.
and they
Yeah.
had to check a bag, but I wouldn't let them check my art portfolio bag. That
Yeah.
that I held on to.
Yeah.
So long story short, my wife picks me up. I go for bags, claim, blah, 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 blah. I literally got home seconds before the kickoff.
Oh my goodness. Did you have a chance to do a pour at least where you sat down?
No, but that came a little later. But and of course the Eagles won. And now they're going to
Yeah.
the Super Bowl, and I'm very
Yeah.
excited.
The
So,
Chiefs again. Nice.
so it was a
Yeah.
busy weekend, Bob.
Yeah. Wow. It sounds like it. Yeah. That's a lot going on in a weekend.
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
well, yeah. I had a busy weekend too, but mine wasn't as exciting. I had a trustee meeting, so it did not go well.
Oh no. Do you have a job
I
with
still
the?
have a job, but I have a few more enemies. so so there you have it.
Uh,
Hmm.
oh, there's a story behind that. You'll have to tell me off air.
Well, yeah, it was a painful morning, but
Uh,
anyway, all's well that ends. So,
yeah. Uh, before we get into our guest today, I just want to, talk about a couple of birthdays. There's some significant birthdays that are up. So if you are listening when this show comes out, which is February 5th, tomorrow, February 6th, is Rick Remender's birthday.
all right, happy birthday, Rick.
Yeah, he's a really great writer, and we loved that story that we covered week after, the long tail story we covered, which was the Escape from Dimension Z.
Mm-hmm.
Really cool story. And then February 8th is Bill Finger. Now, you're like, Bill Finger, why is that name familiar? Well, he was the
No, 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 no.
co-creator of Batman.
Yeah.
But what does he have to do with Captain America? You ask. He created the All Winners Squad in All Winners comics back in 1946.
I didn't know that. So,
And
wow.
you're the Golden Age fan
I
between the two of
know.
us.
Oh my goodness, I didn't know Bill Finger was involved in that.
Yeah, he had
Huh.
his finger in it.
Nice.
Bob, should we get to our guest today?
Yeah, we probably should. Yeah, he's waiting back there.
All right.
Oh, it's such a clutch off-season pickup, Dave.
I was worried we'd bring back the same team.
I meant those blackout motorized shades.
Blinds.com made it crazy affordable to replace our old blinds.
Hard to install?
No, it's easy. I installed these and then got some for my mom. She talked to a design consultant for free and scheduled a professional measure and install.
Hall of Fame son.
They're the #1 online retailer of custom window coverings in the world.
Blinds.com is the GOAT.
Shop Blinds.com right now and get up to 45% off select styles. Rules and restrictions may apply.
So, our guest today is an award winning and New York Times best-selling author whose debut 1972 novel, First Blood, later adapted as the 82 film of the same name, went on to spawn the successful Rambo franchise starring Sylvester Stallone. He has written 28 novels, including several different series of books, and his work has been translated into 30 languages. Cap fans may also know him as the writer of the 2007 six-issue miniseries Captain America: The Chosen, which we covered last week in episode 225. So we are very excited to have David Morrell join us today. David, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. And it's exciting to talk about comic books. That was my first love of reading. I still remember roller skating. In those days, there were comic book stores in a lot of places. They weren't specialty stores. And I remember as a kid, this is in the days of roller skates. That shows you how dated I am. And getting on my roller skates and going down to the comic book store, and they would have stacks and stacks of them on a counter in a kind of lending lot. You could buy them, but they also lent them, so that for 5 cents or 10 cents, you could take home 3 comic books. I forget it, there were different gradations of what it cost. So every Thursday, I remember it was Thursday, I'd go down and I'd trot home with my 3 comic books, and I never got on over it. And then, of course, the change happened with the government thinking that comic books were immoral and bad for us and all that stuff. And so at the end, all that was left was EC, the great Tales from the Crypt types movies. But anyhow, yeah, I love to talk about comics.
So, speaking of which, what were some of your favorites when you were younger and you were reading comics? Did you have a favorite character, or did you even know who the creators were and have a favorite creator?
There was no sense of the creator. That was way before the Batman movies or the Batman comic books in the 80s, when people began to pay attention to who was writing them. But I go back to the EC things, Tales from the Crypt, the horror, all of those that the science fiction ones that EC did were really extraordinary. And Mad Magazine, before it became a Mad Magazine, it was a comic book. So those were some of my favorites. And I did take home some of um, the classic illustrated.
Mm.
I learned about some great books by reading the comic books about them. So
You didn't like try to use those for book reports, did you, or anything, David?
The school I
Take the
went to, they
shortcut?
weren't doing any book reports about, no, nothing like that.
Well, speaking of comics, so how did you, this uh, prolific writer of novels and prose, how did you get involved with Captain America: The Chosen, having not written comics previously? And can
It-
you take us through the process on how that all came about?
Well, it was a fascinating process. There an editor named Andy Schmidt, who worked for Marvel at the time, had this idea that the creator of Rambo, a American military icon, would maybe be a good match for Captain America. And so he contacted me through my website, and then we had phone conversations, and he thought this would be a very interesting pairing. So before I could even get that far, what I said to him was, I don't know the form. I don't know. I don't understand how you write a comic book. So he sent me, there were at the time, I don't know, this is 2004. I don't know if it's changed, but at the time there were 3 formats, and Marvel preferred one of them. And so he sent me copies of scripts that they liked in the format. And what what was a surprise to me, a delight really, is that the writer, it used to be that writers just provided a concept and that the illustrator, the artist, more or less structured it. But what had happened in recent years then was that the writer decided, I just thought this was fascinating. You could decide how many panels were on a page. You could have 1 panel, you could split it, you could have 4, you could have 6, or you could, I mean, you could do whatever design came to your mind that would best make the story communicated. And this excited me a lot. And the people don't, I think, comprehend the amount of words that are involved in per page of a comic book. When my 6-part Captain America: The Chosen was released in book form, I asked Marvel, if how would it be, let's do this, a little more special. I'll write an afterword describing the process, and then we'll have the script, the actual script. It's a photocopy of my script for the first issue. And those, my recollection is that in those days, you could have a comic book of 32 pages. It's not that anymore. And in some cases, a 32-page comic book, I had a 32-page script. They were that detailed. And so anyway, I get ahead of myself. So that really excited me. And then I began thinking about what is the essence of this, that these panels that jump through the action. And I began to think about comic books as being a form of stop action storytelling. And the nearest analog I could think of was, because I'd worked in the movie business, was storyboards for a movie.
Mm-hmm.
And because many directors, either themselves, Alfred Hitchcock, for example, could actually draw the storyboards, but some directors then commissioned them, and then in a way, the movie's been cut even before they photograph it. And I thought, the jump from panel to panel was exceedingly important, as was the jump from one page to the next page. And I began to think about each page as being the equivalent of a paragraph in a story. And that when you changed the subject of a paragraph, it would be the same as if you were changing to a new page. And as we know, some paragraphs are longer than others, and some are composed of short sentences, single lines. And so in the same way, the different images to me were the equivalent of a sentence within a paragraph, of a statement within a paragraph. And I got very excited when I began, thinking of it this way, because then it made it very easy to know when to go to the next page or when to have just one image. And that would be the equivalent of a sentence, as opposed to a paragraph, which would have a whole lot of ideas, and you might have 6 or 8 images on a page. So I got excited by the dynamics of this. Anyhow, Andy and I worked back and forth, and he was kind of teaching me and I was teaching myself. And in a way because I'd had no training, in a way I was inventing my own way about how to write a comic book.
Let's just back up a little bit though, because you described how you were working with Andy, but like, how did you even get roped into this assignment? Because I mean, were you walking down the street and Andy was like, "Hey, that guy right there"? Like, how?
Well, no. As I said, he had this idea of the creator of Rambo or maybe this was before we started talking here. I may have mentioned it earlier. Yeah, Andy had got in touch and he said the creator of Rambo and Captain America, that would be a good match. And so we went back and forth about this, and I was quite surprised that, because I didn't grow up in the medium, but I sure wanted to learn, and I have a filing cabinet over here, and I still have all the documents that he sent me, all those scripts. And also he said, I'll send you the important comic books about how the Captain America legend evolved. Because what I wanted to do, because I had 6 issues and they were 32 pages or the like. I can't quite remember how many pages they were, but they were a lot more than there are now. And I thought, in the story, I will include these moments from his career so that it would be an encapsulation of the Captain America myth.
Well, we'll get to that in a bit, but I want to ask you, did you have any trepidation? I mean, because at this point, by 2004, there's about 6 decades of Captain America mythos, and you're going to write a story where you kill off this beloved character.
Well, and there's a story in that. That was Andy's idea. He said, we're going to kill him off. And as we know in the Marvel universe, right, they keep coming back, right? So, but he said, so we were calling it, he wanted to call it Captain America: The End. All right. Now the plot was mine, but the assignment was he's going to die. Okay, maybe. So, so I'd written the piece. I'm kind of trying to remember if I'd done them all, because there was a drama here, and I'll get to the drama. But he had the scripts, and I looked in the paper one morning, and they say Captain America: The End has just been published, and oh my God, he dies and all that. And I said to myself, what's happening here? Because my piece hadn't been published. So what the hell is this other thing? And so I got on the phone with Andy, and I admit to being a little miffed. And he said, I don't know anything about it either. It was a real Marvel comic book. It turned out that in the Marvel Corporation, another team had been working on killing Captain America. And so I was not happy. And I said, well, we can't move forward. And then he said, no, we'll just change the title. So the
problem solved.
Part 4 or 5 of the 6 issues was called The Chosen, because this is part of the whole story, is that, and I hate to get into specifics because I don't want to have spoilers, but the idea was that Captain America chooses is in a position that he needs to choose like-minded people like him to create that the great theme was we all have it within us to be Captain America. if we but step up to the challenge. And so that was the theme. And so he said, we'll change it to The Chosen. And it turned out nobody remembered, right? I mean, that this had come out maybe 6 months earlier, the Captain America, The End, and now Captain America, The Chosen's come out, which is sort of the same, not the same plot, but the same concept. And nobody spoke about it. So this to me was strange. I really thought there would have been more discussion, but it's the comic book universe. As we know, people come back.
Yeah, it's interesting because what you were referring to was the Steve Epting and Ed Brubaker story
Yes.
of Captain America, and that was the ongoing series, which was in current continuity of Marvel. Whereas your story, which is a Marvel Knights imprint, is
Mm.
out of continuity, but it still is the same character. So
Yeah.
they can kind of relate at the same time. But what was interesting is because we covered this story in our last podcast episode, and Bob and I commented while covering this that it seemed like you drew several elements from a particular story. It was the 1991 miniseries called The Adventures of Captain America, which is written by Fabian Nicieza. And was that one of the books that Andy sent you? Was The Adventures of Captain America miniseries?
I cannot remember that. If I'd had some warning, I could have rooted through my materials that he
It's
sent.
okay.
There were several origin pieces. I mean, I was struck by, and I make a big thing about this in my story, about Captain America being frozen for those years, and then I forget what the effect was when he came back, but I wanted to emphasize that the world had changed, that he had been frozen in one, as it were, America, and now he was back to another, which was not as ideal minded, let us say. And then, of course, the whole plot of back when Captain America was chosen, and when the weakling who was sort of the test case against the big brawny guys who were getting the treatment, and so he sent me that material, and there were some other. It's been so long ago, but I cherry picked the high points. But I remember vividly saying that frozen thing is very important for how Captain America feels that his task is even greater than it would have been, that the world had changed in a way.
Mm. Well, your 1972 book, First Blood, which introduced Rambo to the world, was, I think, probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, books that really addressed the impact of combat trauma on the physical
Yes.
and mental health of soldiers. Long before PTSD made it into the DSM-3, I think in around 1980. And I do want to just say that book, I read it when I was a junior in high school, and maybe paradoxically, it really had a profound impact on me, along with some other books that were in the pop culture at the time. And I actually went into the military after high school. I went to military college and then had a long career in the Marine Corps. But I remember being profoundly moved by that book and by the way that it portrayed the Vietnam veterans, and me wanting to have some sort of solidarity with those men and women.
Well, the story, the movie. I admire the movie a great deal. The story, it's the same plot in the book and the movie, but it's interpreted differently.
Right.
There were 10 years of evolution from my novel to the movie. And it's very interesting to me to compare the two because I really like the movie. I call it like a different train track from the novel, same plot. In fact, if anybody has a home video disc, a Blu-ray, for example, of First Blood, in one of those rare incidents, the producers of the home video asked me if I would record an full-length audio commentary, and authors do not get asked to do that, in which I talk about the background to the novel, and I talk about how the movie evolved, but also talked about the movie itself, and compare them. So that people have told me they found it to be a very informative. There's not a lot of dead air. I was a professor, so I'm giving you the course. It's an interesting. You mentioned PTSD, and in my experience with Rambo, First Blood Part 2, the second movie, that came out in 1985, and for the first time when I was doing interviews, I didn't do the scripts for the movies. I did do novelizations for 2 and 3, and I had a great relationship with Carolco Pictures that made those films, and they asked me to be part of the publicity, and I was often interviewed about my book and the movies and what have you. And the first time I heard the term PTSD was in a radio interview in 1985, and it was like a brand new thing.
Yeah.
And I have you can't document this. I mean, you might try, but you go crazy, a researcher. But my feeling is that Rambo First Blood Part 2, the movie, made PTSD part of common vocabulary.
Yeah, I agree.
And if we want to talk about movies, Rambo having an influence, that's one that it drew people's attention to what this was about. But for me, I had one of the reasons I wrote the novel, and this is all pertinent to Captain America because it's one mirrors the other. I was in graduate school in American literature at Penn State in 1968 when I got the idea for the book. And what partly gave me the idea is that to help pay for my tuition, the university, the English department, is I'm good. I teach well, and so they were having me teach freshman English how to write essays in exchange for giving me tuition. And so I would have been 26, and I'm in class here, and the one course I had, the students, many of them were Vietnam veterans, and they were my age. And they're looking at me and they're saying, "What the hell?" And they'd stay after class and, they'd grumble, "Why weren't you over there? How come you're here telling us this?"
Yeah.
And then I said, "Well, I'm American citizen now, but at the time I was a Canadian citizen, still am. I have dual citizenship. I was a Canadian citizen. I was married. I had a 2-year-old daughter. At that time, there was no way I was going to be going to Vietnam. I mean, even if I tried, they would have said, 'What are you thinking?'"
Right. Yeah.
So I explained that, and then they began telling me what it was like to come back. And so if PTSD in 1985, but here we are in 1968, and they're telling me what I later understood to be part of the syndrome. And they're telling me about the nightmares, the trouble communicating, the alcohol, the drugs, the nightmares, and what tipped me was that I remembered, because I'm of a generation when Audie Murphy, who was in cowboy movies, he was America's most decorated soldier of World War II. And I knew enough about Murphy to know that he did not have a good adjustment to peacetime.
Right.
I mean, he in fact he did a book called To Hell and Back, but he wanted to do another book about what it was like in his experience in normal civilian life, and that he never had a chance to do that. And people often ask me, was there a real life model for Rambo? And yes, it was Audie Murphy.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah. Well, that makes sense though. And,
Yeah.
and so when we get to The Chosen, And again, we see this reoccurring theme of the impact of the constant exposure to danger and the toll that it takes on one's physical and mental well-being, that those constant reminders of one's own mortality.
Yeah.
So I think we understand better now, like where that focus came from.
Well, given that we were talking about that Captain America, and it's difficult to talk about these things without doing spoilers, but I mean, it's the core to the story that Captain America was dying. So why? And I thought to myself, here's this guy since 1941, and he doesn't have a crypto shield. He can be injured. He could be killed. It's just that he has such superior skills because of the treatment he received, that he has that extra advantage. But he was bound to feel afraid. And as we know, heroes are people who overcome their fear in order to do great things. And so I got to thinking that the burden of being Captain America, named after the United States, from 1941, with all the changes, all the wars, all the other stuff that happened, and that freezing, it's such a big deal for me that he jumped to, wait a minute, this isn't the world I was in, that people had changed and not in a good way. So that was, what was the burden of being Captain America, and how could you keep doing it? And then, of course, there's the whole issue of, getting older, which I don't address in it. So those were the sorts of things that were on my mind. And if I can say, and I am a comic book fan, but this is a pretty weighty subject, and it's not, you do see it, but it's not, for me, often enough that you see that kind of subject being addressed in a comic book. Mind you, I had 6 issues to do it in.
We do have a few questions that are sent in from our patrons, which we kind of like to sprinkle in the conversation. And
Absolutely.
The first one we have is from Matthew Glover, and he asks, as a writer, how do you strike a balance between criticizing war and all the horror that comes with it against honoring the nobility of those that are willing to serve and sacrifice?
Yes, and it seems to me that even in my version of Rambo, in my novel First Blood, that that the military virtues are courage, honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. And anybody who steps up to embrace those virtues is a superior person in terms of the character. And so I have never. I'll back up. One of the most important experiences I had as a storyteller was watching Sam Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch when it premiered in 1969. And Peckinpah's The Wild Bunch is a Western which rewrote the way Westerns were perceived. It was extremely realistic. And while a few Western movies before that, for example, Shane, that depicts people being shot in a totally non-glamorous way, unlike some movies where, they're hit in the hand, or I just winged him, that kind of stuff. There is no shock to a body in a B Western. Oh, that's fine. I just got shot in the hand. I'm good. But Peckinpah embraced the trauma of the violence and what it would do to someone. And I remember I was working on First Blood, and I was halfway through the novel, and that movie made me rethink the way I was approaching the violence, and that it was okay to be harsh, that it was okay to be, in a way, realistic, that damage was done, that psychological damage as well as physical. So I've never stayed away from that. In all the books I've written, violence has a cost, but it's how one adjusts to it. In fact, my favorite type of character is somebody who's in the military, who's in law enforcement, who's a executive protector. I did a couple of books about executive protection. People who make it their business to survive, because as I'm sure you observe, in most cases, people are sloppy in their lives. We can sort of make a distinction between professionals and amateurs in the way they live. And most people really don't think a whole lot about where their lives are going or what they're going to do or how they're going to do it. But the kinds of characters that I just described are people who are alert every second. The color-coded condition, orange condition, red condition, black, executive protectors and other people use. If one walks out of a building, does one pause to look around before one goes on? Or does one just go out of the building and blithely walk down the street? And my characters are the type that pause. And if there's a hidden, some of my books have themes that are pretty open, but if there's a theme that's hidden, it's take care, be aware, be conscious, don't be passive. And the characters I generally choose are that way.
In the late 1990s, David, I was assigned to a reserve unit in Hayward, California. I was active duty, working at a reserve unit, and I spent a lot of time at the Barnes and Nobles in downtown San Francisco. And I remember picking up a book, late 90s again, and it was Mind Trek by Joe McGonigal. And it was all about the remote viewing program that the U.S. Army, Intel, and then eventually the CIA, and before that the DIA, had in the 70s and 80s about how to use psychic capabilities to remote view targeting operations. And I remember reading that and being fascinated by it. And then I pick up The Chosen, and there it is. You've pulled that thread and woven it into that story. And I got to know, where did you become familiar with that whole program?
Well, I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, okay, which is on one side, it's a valley, and on one side, on the eastern side of the valley, there's Santa Fe. On the western side of the valley, just slightly over the hill, is Los Alamos. And I had a friend who worked there in the non-lethal weapon research department. And I'm obviously not going to give his name at this bit. But he said,
if you did, you're going to have to be alert.
I know.
You're going to have to watch when you walk out the door.
I'm gone. But we have, for example, it isn't here anymore, but there used to be something called the Taos Hum. Taos is north of us. Mm-hmm. And there was a hum up there that drove people crazy. And it went on it was intermittent, but when it was there, it drove people nuts. But I later learned, I'm not saying that Taos Hum was Los Alamos gone berserk, but I later learned that the non-lethal weapons research did involve very low levels of sound that you might not even be aware of, but that could really mess with you. And of course, the embassy, is it the Cuban embassy?
It's in Havana. Yeah.
Right. So I mean and for years they've been complaining about something that's really makes them sick and all, and no one wants to acknowledge that it might in fact be a weapon. It's much easier to say, well, and so he was telling me about this sort of thing. And then he began talking to me about remote viewing. Now, this wasn't all in one session. He was married, and we went out, we'd go out socially sometimes. But, for some reason, he liked to talk about this. And so he was telling me about the remote viewing and how it worked. And, and how in the simple version, they'd have person on one side of the room and on the other side with a barrier, and one person would have a deck of cards. and they'd be looking at the cards, and then the other person would try to read this person's mind in order to determine what the cards were. And I can't remember how effective it was. I can't remember if he said it was a wash, that the guesses were as good as, as whatever. But I remember thinking, and this is way before I was asked about Captain America, but the remote viewing, it stuck in my mind, and what it could be used for. And then there's also a book, and I wish I could think of the title, about some of these programs and how some of the folks that were part of them didn't do well psychologically as a consequence. And I'm sure there's a story in that, but I wasn't interested in going in that direction. But I thought, that it would be really cool to be able to have Captain America in his decline using a remote viewing technique, which would weaken him. I mean, it's killing him as he's trying to reach out to find those who can continue his legacy. So anyway, that's what that was about. But yeah, it was a lot of fun to think about.
So when you were considering ideas for Captain America: The Chosen, you you're what inspired you to move away from what typically, many people think of when they think of Cap, his physical attributes, and you went away from that to focus on his mind and his spirit? And what inspired you to go in that direction?
I think it's just in my nature. When I also did comic books for Marvel, for Spider-Man and for Wolverine. And I have them up here beside me if anybody, was curious about what those were. And in each case, well, Andy comes to me and says, write about Captain America. And another editor said, write about Spider-Man. And another one said, write about Wolverine. And in each case, I did a deep dive into what makes them what they are. And of course, if you're dealing with Spider-Man, it's with great power comes great responsibility. And that's a whole subject for another conversation, in which Spider-Man would have to choose between Aunt May to save her or to save all these other people who were strangers to him. So would he let them die in order to save Aunt May, or would he let Aunt May die in order to save? And the idea that they were strangers, that that in effect he would be partial, he'd be prejudiced to save her, he'd be biased, and Spider-Man isn't the kind of person who would. I mean, that's the kind of stuff he worries about. So in each case, I wanted to get to the core. What is it? Who is Captain America? Who is Spider-Man? Who is Wolverine? And so as I was working on this, at the time, the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, I put it, it's in the book, the 9/11 attacks and the other attacks. There's some in there I was reading through. I reread the issues before our conversation, and I was struck by how many topical examples of terrorism I used. Buses blowing up in England, subways blowing up, the underground, as they call it, blowing up in England, and the World Trade Center, and how at the time everybody knew what those were. But all these years later, you'd almost think I made this, not 9/11, but the double-decker bus explosions, and I mean, you'd almost think I made them up because people don't remember anymore. But at the time, I was I wandered afield to what I was talking about, but it interested me that when the wars had happened, 9/11 was very recent, and we had some drama with Marvel about this, that I thought, I'm going to set this in Afghanistan because these are the new military heroes. So I'm going to set this in Afghanistan, and right away I got pushback. Well, that's not true. I wrote the first. They weren't committed, but I just loved the project. I was so excited. So I just said, I'm going to write the first issue on spec. I'll just write it as if they've never approached me. So I sent Andy the script, and he was stunned because nobody had ever done this before. I mean, somebody, an established writer whom they were talking to, and he said, well, you don't have a contract. I can't pay you for this. I said, I know that. I said, just show this around and let's see if we can't get this thing going. And so there was some talk, but there was a lot of pushback in Marvel because it was so real that this was going to be an actual war that was happening now as we were reading about it, not World War II, not any of the conflicts that we saw Captain America in before. And so they hesitated and hesitated, and I thought, this isn't right. So then on spec, I wrote the second issue and I sent it in. And I wound up doing 3 issues for free. I got paid eventually, but they could have said, nah, this isn't. And they said, but we're still a little, Afghanistan. I said, I tell you what, let's invent a country. We won't call it Afghanistan. I think I don't know, it's Uzbekistan, or I can't remember what the hell the name was. And they said, oh, okay. And at one point, you just love it when corporate minds say something like this. What the word that came back to me from Andy was, they said, this is something we should do. And because it was timely and important, and it was about sacrifice and the military virtues, and a man who had committed himself, and it was destroying him because he was such a hero.
Back in 2007, when the first issue came out, it was about 6 months after we see Captain America assassinated in issue 25 of the ongoing series.
That was a lot of drama, I have to tell you.
And then a reader goes to the store, picks up issue 1, and they read like 13, 14 pages before Captain America even shows up.
Yes.
Right? And then even then, Captain America is a bit of a supporting player to Corporal James Newman.
Yes.
And yet, despite the misgivings that I think maybe a lot of readers had with that first issue, it is quintessentially a Captain America story with the Captain America heart in its message. And so,
this is, keep going. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I've read this series a number of times over the years, and it's special to me, so much so that I bought some original art from this series that means a lot to me. But I know that each reader takes something different based on their experiences. But I want to know, what was the core message you were hoping to convey to the reader?
Well, let's go back. Well, the very name Newman, right? The new man. I mean, I'm not normally so blatant, but that this is, he's passing it on, that there's a symbolic part of the name. And honestly, I don't do this much, and chances are nobody would ever notice it until I embarrass myself by saying it. But that's sort of what I was thinking. And no one has ever told me that there was some controversy over the fact that Cap doesn't show up until halfway through, but let's go back on that, because I feel that the way to read comic books is in a physical form, and I'm not against reading digitally and all that, but there's something dramatic about turning the pages. And when I was doing the series, I thought, if he's going to be passing on the heritage, I have to start with the new guy. So we see him in and he's married, he has a child, and we know how much he sacrificed in order to be there. Moreover, in my script, if people have the collected book and it has the first issue at the back, you see my directions, my suggestions, let us say, to the colorist. And this is a good moment to pause, because it takes 3 to tango. I mean, there's the writer, and there is the artist, Mitch Breitweiser, but there is also a colorist, Brian Reber in this case. Now, these days, colorists get credit if they have writer, illustrator, colorist. Back then, the colorist was not. I mean, they got credit on the credit page on the inside, but not on the cover. But very often now, the colorist gets credit on the cover, and we. Mitch and I, we exchanged emails all the time about this, and so did Brian and I, because I had this idea twofold about the way a physical book works, so that in the first couple of pages, it's desert colors. And I said this, I didn't know it, I wasn't addressing Brian, I was just saying to the colorist. And then I found out he was assigned. And I said, let's make this a gritty kind of sandy color, except when there's firearms. And then we'll have the bright flashes. And if there are explosions, then we'll have some color. So we'll have and the sky would be muted. It's like there was a sand going through the sky. And we'd be going through and we're turning the page, and Newman hears a voice. And he's thinking, what is this? And so he's turning, and as he's turning, the reader is turning the page, and there is our first full page. And it's Captain America, first full page. I held back. I said, no, if I'm going to use the full page, it's going to be dramatic. And it's the first time all the colors are used. So it's, sandy, a couple of flashes, we turn, oh, there he is. And that's I'm just so proud of that effect. And other times I did the same thing. Now, sometimes, because they have ads in comic books, sometimes the effects I planned for turning the page got muted. But I will say that even in the comic book, you turn the page and here was an ad, but here was Cap on the right, so, assuming everybody said, to hell with the ad, it's turned, oh, there he is. So it still kind of worked. But I just loved the idea that the three of us were collaborating, it was a very exciting, stimulating time. But the colors are exceedingly important. No one ever told me that some readers had a problem with Cap showing up halfway through.
Well, I think you buy a Captain America comic, you think you're going to see Captain America on
where the hell is he,
with
right?
the splash page, right? that first page. So yeah, it's a slow burn.
It's a slow burn, yeah, but I wouldn't do it any other way. There's no, it is the way the story had to be. But that's great. I like that. Unintended something or others.
So as I mentioned before, we covered the 6 issues in the last episode. So you may want to check that out if you want to get our interpretation of everything.
Oh, sure.
One of the things I did note early on in the very first couple of pages of the first issue was the coloring and how everything was tan, right? The sky was tan, the buildings were tan, everything had that color. So it was acknowledged and it was noted as far as the how well crafted it was color-wise as well.
And it continues because they go into the cave, the tunnel, and the blast buries them, and all they're seeing now is lights from their lanterns, from their helmets. And so in one form or another, either in the muted desert or in the cavern, half the book is in muted colors. But then when we switch back, like when we're in the, let's say, a hospital where Cap is, then the colors are brighter. But even his uniform, is fading as he is. So I'm having done, worked with 3 characters, the colors, coloring in this was, I mean, Brian did a hell of a job. And I also have to note that when it came to my Spider-Man, it's a two-parter. My artist there, the artist assigned to me, and actually he asked for it, was Klaus Janson,
Mm.
who had worked on the, you know, the Great Revival in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and that was fun to work with. And Klaus told me, because I really like working with people, Klaus told me that his relationship to Aunt May reminded him that the character's relationship to Aunt May reminded him of his relationship to his ailing mother. And so he was sort of seeing in his work in the Spider-Man, he was seeing it as a kind of, he himself was emotionally invested in the character. It's a great, it's very interesting to see the way people can do really interesting work because they're, you know, psychologically motivated because they identify with the situation.
So another longtime patron of the show, Mark Domeyer, he asks, I did not know about this series, Captain America: The Chosen, because he was out of collecting when it came out. So he was really excited, and he went ahead and read it. And so his question is, how intensive is the research process to try to accurately portray parts of the world and the reality of the events of war?
Mhm. Well, I've been doing, you know, from First Blood on, I've been doing a lot of interviews, and I read a lot. I'd not at that time had not been to that kind of war zone. I mean, I'm a civilian, and by the time I was a citizen, I became a citizen. I was told that they wouldn't want me in the military, but just a kind of offside comment. In 2010, I was part of the first USO authors tour. The first time they sent a bunch of authors to a war zone, and that was in Iraq. So we came in through Kuwait and then went into Iraq, and I was there for, I think, 5 days at various bases. So I can't say that was of any use to me for Captain America because that was much later. But a lot of it is just, you know, being aware and, you know, reading and paying attention. And um, I think that storytellers tend to have a greater absorption quality, that they tend to notice more, that they tend to absorb more. So if when I was working on this, I must have read materials about what the combat was like in Afghanistan. Um, but um, there is no one item that I remember as much as just absorbing and trying to get it right. And I do know that Mitch Breitweiser did a lot of research into military vehicles that were in that theater, and to try to get those vehicles so that someone who'd been there would say, well, that's phony, that's not, and the weaponry itself, because I didn't describe any of that. I mean, I just said, you know, military vehicle. I forget what else, what I would have used. So a lot of the way that authenticity feels in it, you know, as I said, I read this yesterday, and after many years, because you know, writers shouldn't go back and read their stuff. They should be moving forward. And so I read it almost as if somebody else had written it, and I was very surprised by how authentic it felt, and that would be in large part because of Mitch.
So we do have one more patron question, and that is from Aaron Paul.
Mhm.
And he wants to ask if
Is
you.
this Aaron Paul, the actor?
No, I don't think so. I've never seen his face, so I can't say for
Okay.
sure. But it could.
Well,
Could
if it
be.
is Aaron, we
Could
like your
be.
stuff.
But he wanted to know if you'd ever had any thought about writing a story featuring, say, John Walker, who was U.S. agent, and or a Bucky Barnes, or perhaps even Frank Castle, the Punisher. But what he really wants to know is you've written a lot about military veterans, and perhaps there's some other character that you would like to write in for the comics. Would it be a military veteran, or perhaps some other Marvel character that you might be interested in?
Um, to back up on that, it's a closed shop. You just don't, even though I wrote on spec for the first 3 Captain America issues, um, I mean, but we were in conversation. It's not like it was a cold thing that I was sending in. But if you don't get invited, you don't get to play there. And there was a strange thing that happened. And I think everybody who was involved at the time has moved on so that I can talk about it. But for my 2-part Spider-Man, the wrong first issue was released. It was before the edits. It was an early version, and it had so many mistakes. It had repeated captions. It had images that should have had captions but didn't, or it had images that did have captions but shouldn't have, and it was really bad. And because I take pride in my work, and because people are gracious enough to say they enjoy my work, I feel that I should say this is wrong. So I went on social media and I said, hey, folks, if you think something's wrong with this first issue, you're right, and it's not me. And the wrong issue was released. Well, there was a huge outcry from Marvel, who said, why did you do that? This happens all the time. This is one person telling me this, all right? I'm not going to say Marvel themselves, Phil, but I was getting a pushback, not from Andy, by then he was gone. There was somebody else, and we won't even bother with the name. And he said, just let it go. Why not? And I said, no. And then fortunately, the second issue was correct. Now, the irony here is because of the uproar I caused, the salespeople said that they're selling a ton of these comic books and that you should get this guy to do something else. And so that's when they came to me to do Wolverine. Do the one, but people have long memories, right? So the Wolverine was the last. I would love to have continued writing comic books, especially for these iconic characters to get at their core. Um, but Wolverine, which is better, to be an animal or a human? Which side of yourself would you? And in my version, Wolverine chooses the animal side because he's so disillusioned with people. So that was my theme. So I'm somewhat of a cynic, as you might guess. But that was it. I never got asked back to the rodeo because and now of course it's all. I'm probably the only one that remembers, and now everybody's listening to us.
That's right, and we know Aaron Paul, so
yeah,
I mean, we could
that's
probably
right.
get a good word. We know,
and we love his work.
So speaking of work, David, is there anything? What's keeping you busy nowadays? Is there anything coming up that you wanted to talk about?
Well, I'm always working, and I can't talk about it because there might be a title change, but there is a movie that's been finished that might be coming out this year, but I've been told not to talk about it because if I give the one title and it's another title, there'd be a lot of confusion. But one thing that I'm very interested in, and this ties in with our Rambo discussion earlier, is a friend of mine, Nat Segaloff, who has written books about Arthur Penn and William Friedkin and John Milius and other movie icons. He has written a book called The Rambo Report, 5 films, 3 books, 1 legend. And he's a brilliant researcher, and it's the whole Rambo mystique. It's the history of the movies. It's the history of my book. It's the video games. It's the knives. It's really an exciting book. And Nat, because we knew each other from another, he interviewed me for another project about a screenwriter we admire named Sterling Silliphant. And and he said, can I interview you for this? And so in the long run, he allowed me to read every draft of the book. and there were like 4 drafts. And I was able to say, I don't think this happened this way. And, he was able to go do his resources and see what his other people were saying. And it's as factually accurate as as the book could be. And then he asked me, and I did. I wrote a foreword for the book. And so it's a vastly entertaining, very, very interesting. Like, who knew I did that Steve McQueen was at one point Rambo, and that Sidney Pollack, one of my very favorite directors, was going to direct him in 1975 until they realized that Steve, who was in his 40s, could not possibly in 1975 be a Vietnam veteran because they were all young people. And it's so fascinating stories like this, and how Paul Newman might have been Rambo, and Martin Ritt might have been the director, and John Frankenheimer might have been the director, and onward that way. So there's a lot and about Audie Murphy, and where the name Rambo came from, not from a person, but I don't want to. I don't want to spoil the surprise here. And anyhow, that comes out on April 28th. And I think anybody who's interested in popular culture, in movies, it was one of the longest film developments, 10 years, very dramatic from book to movie. And he chronicles it all. And I think people will find it, not just Rambo fans, but they'll certainly enjoy it, but movie people in general, or cultural people in general. So the Rambo Report, and that's on April 28th. And Nat will buy me a hamburger or something for promoting his book.
Excellent. Well, we encourage people to check that out in April, called the Rambo Report. So thank you for giving us a heads up on that. And also, listeners, if you want to check out more about David Morrell, go to his website, which is davidmorrell.net. And you
Mhm.
can check out a whole bunch of great backstories and images and things like that on his website as well. And
And
there'll be a link to that in our show notes.
And on the writing page, if they go there, they will find my essay about writing, because I have an essay at the end of the Captain America book about doing that. But then I have an essay on my website, on the writing page, about writing Spider-Man, and Klaus Janson, and how he and I worked together and what we were trying to do there. So anybody interested in writing comic books or knowing how comic books are written will find that essay of interest. And there's a lot of other stuff. The website's almost like a magazine. There's just so much stuff on it.
Hmm.
Well, David, we really do appreciate you joining the show today, and it was really fun wrapping cap with you.
Well, I have fond memories of these projects, and the fact that people are reading them again, and there's a good message. There's a very strong, positive message in
Mhm.
the book, in the series, that I think people could benefit from.
Indeed.
All of us have it in us to be Captain America.
Well, you couldn't have said it any better. And on that note, we're going to say have a good night and thanks for joining the show.
And thank you for inviting me.
Oh, wow. What a fun, interesting conversation with David Morrell. What a pleasure to have on the show.
He's such a great guy, so full of energy and just enthusiasm and great stories. This was a real treat.
Yeah. And he summed it up so well at the very end, basically that we all have Captain America in us. And it's just a matter of, we step up to the call.
Yeah, I think he's gonna really appreciate. I know you send a coin off to to the folks that we interview, our guests, and I think that will have special meaning for him because so many of those values on the coin are reflected in the story of The Chosen. So I think he'll display that proudly. I'm sure of it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Was it, I think courage was one of them.
Mm-hmm. Honor,
We
sacrifice, and
sacrifice,
loyalty.
courage and sacrifices on our coins. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So I think hopefully he'll like that.
yeah.
So Bob, next episode, come back. We're kicking off the next epic of our long tail story. So, for listeners at home, we generally have an interview in the first Wednesday of the month, and then our second Wednesday of the month is our long tail story, and we're picking up where we left off with the Secret Empire. So we're going to go back to Steve Englehart and Sal Buscema, and in the year of 1974, and we're going to kick off where Cap basically, or Steve Rogers, I should say, gives up being Captain America.
Right.
So you don't want to miss that.
No, that's a great story and a recurring theme, but the first time.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. So it'll be fun covering that long tail story the second week of every month. So come back next week for that. And Bob, as always, it has been so much fun wrapping Cap with you.
It has. I can't wait till next week, Rick.
All right. He's Bob Lucius. I'm Rick Verbanis. And if you don't mind, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen. If you're on YouTube right now, give us a thumbs up. If you're on Apple, give us a 5-star review. And if you're on Facebook, please leave a comment. We always enjoy hearing from you. And as always, thanks for listening to another episode of the Captain America Comic Book Fans Podcast.